Imagine a clock. But instead of counting hours and minutes, it's counting dollars. Every single second, the numbers spin so fast they're a blur. Right now, that clock is ticking toward $39 trillion. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. Experts are warning that this debt time bomb could actually explode before the 2026 midterm elections. We're talking about a potential financial reckoning that could send the stock market into a tailspin and reality check the entire American way of life. Is this just another the sky is falling prediction, or are we finally hitting the tipping point where debt starts to kill the economy? Today, we're diving into the data the government doesn't want you to worry about, from the $1 trillion interest bill we're about to pay, to the secret threshold that developed nations almost never survive. To understand why this is happening now, you have to look at how fast the fuse is burning. For decades, the US has lived beyond its means, but we've entered a new, much more dangerous era. In just the last decade, Congress has authorized trillions in spending, causing the national debt to nearly triple since 2009. We are now in a position where the current $33 trillion-plus debt has officially surpassed the size of our entire economy. That means our debt-to-GDP ratio is at its highest level since World War II. But back then, we were paying off the debt from a global war. Today, we're adding to it during a period of economic growth. As we head into 2026, a mix of rising interest rates, political turmoil, and a massive decline in global trust is creating a perfect storm. A former official from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, is now sounding the alarm, saying the world is losing faith in the US dollar. If that trust snaps, the time bomb isn't just a metaphor anymore, it's a market crash. So, how much debt is too much? Economists used to argue about this, but a massive study by the World Bank actually found a specific number. They analyzed 101 countries over nearly 30 years to find the tipping point where sovereign debt turns bad. For developed countries like the United States, that tipping point is 77% of GDP. Once a country's debt-to-GDP ratio crosses that 77% line, every additional percentage point of debt costs the economy 0.017 percentage points of annual real growth. It sounds like a small number, but it's cumulative. It's like an anchor dragging behind a ship. The more debt you add, the slower the ship moves. The US didn't just cross that line, we blew past it. We are currently sitting well over 100% debt to GDP. According to the World Bank's logic, we are actively sacrificing our future economic growth just to service the debt we already have. If you want to see how bad this can get, look at the extreme cases. In Nicaragua, high debt was responsible for an annual loss of 4.7 percentage points of GDP growth. Over 28 years, that added up to a staggering 264% loss in total economic potential. While the US isn't there yet, the principle is the same. Persistent violations of these debt thresholds eventually break the engine of the economy. But the tipping point isn't the only problem. We're also falling into what economists call the interest trap. For a long time, the US could borrow for almost nothing because interest rates were so low. Those days are over. The combination of massive debt and higher interest rates has sent our borrowing costs into the stratosphere. In 2025 alone, interest costs on the national debt totaled $970 billion. To put that in perspective, we spent more on interest than we did on our entire national defense budget, which was $893 billion. We spent more on interest than we did on Medicaid. And it's getting worse. For fiscal year 2026, interest payments are projected to hit $1.0 trillion. By 2036, that number could soar to $2.1 trillion. Think about that. We are now paying an average of $2.8 billion every single day just in interest. That's $2.8 billion daily that isn't going to infrastructure, education, or healthcare. It's just going to pay the rent on money we already spent. This creates a vicious cycle. We have to borrow money just to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed. Within the next 5 years, interest payments will officially exceed the entire national defense budget. Half of every dollar the government borrows is now projected to go strictly toward interest payments. Now, you might have heard of a theory called modern monetary theory, or MMT. Some people use this to argue that we shouldn't worry about the debt at all. The core idea of MMT is that because the US borrows in its own currency, it can never run out of money because it can always print more. MMT supporters say the government should focus on full employment and Green New Deal projects rather than obsessing over deficits. But critics, including former IMF officials and the Cato Institute, say this is a dangerous fantasy. They argue that printing money doesn't create a free lunch. If the government prints money to pay its debts, and that money supply exceeds what the public actually wants to hold, prices will skyrocket. Basically, inflation becomes a hidden tax. It's the worst kind of tax because it hits the poor the hardest. Economists warn that inflating away the value of the debt is essentially a default by another name. If the world loses confidence that the US dollar will hold its value, they will demand even higher interest rates to lend us money, which only accelerates the crash. This brings us to the specific warning for 2026. Desmond Lockman, a former deputy director at the IMF, believes we are approaching a severe financial reckoning in the run-up to next year's midterm elections. Why 2026? Because markets are starting to see little reason to trust the US. Confidence is eroding because of a toxic mix of rising debt, political turmoil, and a disregard for the rule of law. Lockman points out that the US dollar actually fell 10% against other global currencies in the first half of 2025. That was the dollar's worst performance since 1953. At the same time, gold prices have jumped 25%, which is usually a sign that investors are fleeing to safety because they don't trust the government's paper money. The time bomb isn't just about the total amount of debt, it's about the fact that we may be losing the world's permission to live beyond our means. For decades, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency, making up 58% of all global foreign reserves. If investors start to dump US Treasury bonds because they fear a crisis, it could trigger a dollar and bond market collapse that nobody is prepared for. So, what does this actually mean for you? If the debt bomb explodes, it's not just a headline. It's a shock to your wallet. A US default or a major debt crisis would likely tip the entire world into an immediate recession. Economists at Goldman Sachs estimate that even just hitting the debt ceiling without a deal would immediately halt about 1/10 of all US economic activity. We're talking about the potential loss of 3 million jobs. It would also make life significantly more expensive. Interest rates for mortgages, car loans, and credit cards would likely skyrocket. Some estimates suggest a default could add $130,000 to the cost of an average 30-year mortgage. And then there are the autopilot programs. Currently, mandatory spending, things like Social Security and Medicare, makes up 70% of the federal budget. In 10 years, that's projected to hit 90%. The problem? Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund is projected to be insolvent by 2031. The Social Security Trust Fund is expected to dry up by 2033. If we are spending all our money just to pay interest on the debt, there will be nothing left to save these programs when they run out of cash. The final trigger for this bomb is the debt ceiling. This is the legal limit on how much the government can borrow. Since 1960, Congress has raised the ceiling 78 times. It used to be a routine procedure, but in the last decade, it's become a high-stakes game of chicken. When the government hits the ceiling, the Treasury has to use extraordinary measures to keep paying the bills, like delaying payments to government employee pension funds. But these measures only last a few months. If the ceiling isn't raised, the US could default on its debt payments for the first time in history. This would be catastrophic. It would diminish the dollar's appeal as a global currency and could cause global financial chaos. Even the threat of a default is enough to cause damage. In 2011, a debt ceiling deadlock led to the first-ever downgrade of the US credit rating and increased our borrowing costs by $1.3 billion that year alone. The bottom line is this: America's fiscal house is not in order. We are currently on an unsustainable path driven by trillion-dollar interest costs and a mounting debt that has already surpassed the size of our economy. As we approach 2026, the warning signs are everywhere. The dollar is weakening, gold is rising, and the interest trap is closing. We've been told for years that the debt doesn't matter, but the laws of economics suggest otherwise. Whether it's the 77% tipping point or the 2026 midterm reckoning, the days of America living beyond its means are rapidly coming to an end. This isn't just a political problem, it's an American problem that requires real bipartisan solutions. Because as the old saying goes, a house divided among itself cannot agree to pay its bills, and a house that doesn't pay its bills won't stand for long. The clock is ticking. The question is, will we defuse the bomb, or are we just waiting for the blast?